Welcome back. Now, the 2024 budgetary allocation of 4.6% to Nigeria's health sector has raised concerns about the federal government meeting the healthcare needs of the nation, especially given the persistent challenges faced by the health sector. Just 1.3 trillion naira was earmarked for the health sector in the 2024 fiscal year budget of over 28 trillion naira. Now, these allocation represents 4.6% of the total budget, deviating significantly from the 2001 Abuja Declaration's recommendation that African governments allocate a minimum of 15% of their annual budget to the health sector. The 15% benchmark set by the Abuja Declaration is intended to ensure adequate funding for healthcare services and infrastructure development to enhance the overall well-being of the populace, which the federal government has failed to fulfill. As the government navigates through fiscal planning, stakeholders in the health sector have called for a reassessment of budgetary priorities to align with international standards and address the health care demands of the growing population. But the Medical and Dental Consultants Association of Nigeria referred to the budget allocation as inadequate, calling on all governments to increase budgetary allocations to the health sector. Dr. Philip Njamanze, who is the chairman, Chidikon Medical Services, Owerri in Imo State, now joins us on the program to discuss more on this. Thank you very much, Doc, for joining us on the program. 4.6% allocation to the health sector in this year's budget, not a surprise at all, since that declaration was made in 2001. Nigeria has so far not been able to meet it. In fact, in the last 23 years, the average allocation to the health sector has been just around 4.7%. And last year we had somewhere around 5.75%, but this year it's dropped to 4.6%. What's your take on this allocation? And do you think we would ever meet that recommendation of 15%?
Well, thank you for having me. Now, there are ways to look at the national budget for health. The health budget, you know that the major player in health services is the private arm. So in a state like Imo State, you have almost 75%. It's in the private sector. Oh. So when you are calculating the total budget in health, you have to take into account what is being spent in the private sector. Yeah. So this is just one segment. What the federal government is a minor player in health, unfortunately so, especially in the therapeutic arm. The budget should be targeted because there are three arms of medicine or health to say. One arm is the therapeutic arm, that's where you go to hospital and receive healthcare. The other arm is the research arm, whereby it turns out scientific work in health. And the third arm is the preventing arm, which the NCDC plays a role. So these three arms must be funded. Usually, government spends money, majority of the funds, in research and prevention of diseases. In the therapeutic arm is predominantly the private sector. What government should do here is to provide access to capital. And for years, we have been talking about the health bank. So there will be a bank which gives out loans with single-digit interest rates. So you might get a loan for development of a hospital or health facility with about 5% interest rate. And that's the role of government in driving this. So the 4.6% might still have an impact, even though it's grossly inadequate, but it has to be wisely spent. Government has no business setting up all these multiples of hospitals and primary health care centers. The private will do that more economically and even more precisely. But you have to give them access to capital. So when they want to borrow money, it will be come at a very low interest rate. And of course, government should be spending a lot of money in the research arm, which basically is almost absent. The the prevention arm, which actually NCDC, is grossly inadequate, because you should have NCDC at all levels: the national, the state, the local government, and ward level. And at each level, you must have a surgeon general. Before, in the 60s, we had even surgeon general, and that was the third person in the hierarchy of Nigerian politics, at least the government politics. So the truth of the matter is that even the meager resources that are being budgeted for health is not wisely spent. That's the main problem.
And because you talked about research, I'm just going through the breakdown of the health sector budget now. For instance, for the National Institute of Pharmaceutical Research and Development, the budget is just around 1.5 trillion naira. And then for the Nigerian Institute of Medical Research is just around 2 trillion. Is it 2 trillion or 2 billion? 2 trillion naira, I think. You look at that.
2 billion.
You think those are enough?
No. These are very small amounts. They can only do infrastructural development. This in billion. So the truth of the matter is that these things are not the even correct way of spending this money. When you come to health, let's say, for example, you want to budget money for health. The research arm should be as big as a state budget. So you will have something like 150 billion naira budgeted for research in health. What does this money do? This money offers small grants to investigators to find out, are we really having clusters of developing Lassa fever infection in the most remote areas? So he gets a grant for about 5 million or 10 million naira and goes to do that work. That work could warn us right on time so that we can take the preventive action that is required, so that the whole nation doesn't have to be engrossed in a health emergency. So even though it's 5 million or 10 million we spend for that investigator to do that, but that result has prevented the whole nation from locking down the whole economy.
I can understand your point on the side of the private sector in all of this, but so some people have also argued that, look, with the private sector, sometimes healthcare delivery could become very expensive, and that's the reason why the government plays a very huge role. You talked about, for instance, like primary healthcare. You said that should be left to the private sector. But the question is, do you think the average Nigerian would be able to afford healthcare delivery if they were predominantly handled by the private sector, especially at that level?
Well, I happen to have been around for a number of years, and the government services are not even cheaper. They are, unfortunately, it's not just that they are not cheaper, they are almost unusable, because what normally happens is that when these patients move there and there is any serious case, they are so grossly understaffed. They don't have the doctors, they don't have the nurses, they don't have the medical personnel to even attend to the people. So even though they might artificially create access, but access to what? The service that is non-existent. So the correct thing to do is to offer grants and subsidies to the private sector. For example, if somebody wants to put up a private primary health care facility in somewhere in Damaturu, for example, and he gets a single digit interest rate of 3%, and he gets about 200 million to establish it. He knows that he can actually make it and break even with that type of capital. So the truth of the matter is not actually just creating access for access sake. and making prices artificially low in quest, but in real terms, you really have very expensive care and even dangerous, because if you open these primary healthcare facilities and there are no nurses and doctors to man them, it will just be a place where people die rather than a place where they receive healthcare. So I think there has to be a whole rethinking of how we organize our health. And we should prioritize the enormous sacrifice and enormous potential that is in the private sector. In a country like the United States, you will think, oh no, wait a minute, they have good healthcare, but it's predominantly private. The government of United States, only if it owns hospitals, only the VA military hospitals. That is the Veterans Administration hospitals for the Army and the people in the armed forces. So, and it is important to really reorganize our system to match our structure, where we have the people, personnel, the motivation that is in the private sector.
Now, it's, you know, each time people, we talk about this 15% allocation to the health sector, everyone looks at the federal government, and that's understandable anyway. But the truth is that we have 36 governments in this country. You have the federal government at the top, and then you have 36 governments. And even if the federal government were to allocate 15% of its own budget to the health sector, but if the states are not doing the same thing, do you think that would make any difference at all? Because it appears people are also not looking at the states.
Yes, the states have to come in. Actually, the only money, when I scrutinize some of the budgets of the states, is basically the money they use to pay salaries and sometimes some infrastructural repairs in the health in the public health sector in the states. But this is insufficient. That's why we are talking about reorganization. There should be a state medical research institutes which actually funds research in the facilities, both government and private. The United States, for example, just to give you another example, most of the hospitals, all the big hospitals like Harvard, Stanford, they run on grants from the government for research. They are giving $80 million, $100 million dollar grants. And these grants are used to support investigators. That's where you hear their name in publication. They have discovered this and discovered that. That money is coming from the taxpayer who funded the research. And the results from this research go back to the people to provide better healthcare. This is the correct approach to health. But government doesn't invest anything in the most productive sector of the economy, which is the private medical care. And that's really what is holding Nigerian medicine from advancing from where it is at this moment. And that's why you have all the Japa syndrome is coming up, because the doctor really has nothing to work with. So he is better actually lending his services elsewhere.
I mean, you run a medical facility. If you were to tell me what difference it would make, for instance, for your own medical facility, if you were to get some kind of grants funding from the government, to do some of the things that you do.
It would make a profound difference. Like in our facility where we render medical care and also do scientific work, some of the very extraordinary things we have done came from grants by collaboration with other institutions from outside, and then we were able to do things. Can you imagine our government funding our own research? That will transform healthcare here. We will have a lot more personnel, a lot more young people to train, because they are running on grants from government. Instead of having 1 or 2 or 3 doctors, we will have 10. Maybe 5 of them are funded by research grants from the federal government. So it will make a big difference, a very transformative difference. And the institutional impact will be enormous. So I think the problem is that we have to reprioritize everything. And what President Bola Ahmed Tinubu could do is to convene another health summit where he gets to hear from the real stakeholders what needs to be done in reorganization of health in this country from the Nigerian doctors.
Well, I think that's
and
where we have to leave
pharmacists
it.
and
Dr. Phil
nurses.
Njamanze, thank you very much for coming on the program, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so very much. All right, that's how much we can take on the program this week. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.